Okay, there we go. How are you today?
Good.
Good, very good. Could I answer any questions before we get going again today? All right. Basically where we left off, we had gone through and we'd put together this simple little application that has both gadgets and gadget types in a one-to-many relationship, right? We went through all that essentially because we were going through and talking about controllers. So I think at this point we've kind of gone through and seen most of the neat little things that controllers do, sort of the role that they play, what they're supposed to be used for, that kind of stuff. There's one last little trick that we can do with controllers that I haven't mentioned to you yet, and that's that controllers can have special methods in them called filters. Basically what these little filter methods provide is a way for us to have methods that are executed automatically for us, either before, after, or around/during other controller actions. So if we wanted to, for example, have some basic action that took place before any of our other controller actions took place or after any of our other controller actions took place, instead of us having to go to every single controller action and put in a method call inside of them, we could instead just use these filters to basically make it happen. Right? Typically, these filters are created just by calling the little filter methods themselves. Usually I just stick them up here at the top of the controller. So for example, there's a before filter. So if I said before filter some action or some method, let's say, right, what would happen because of that call is a method called some method would execute before every other controller action. So if somebody went to access the index, the first thing that would happen is it would execute some method, then it would execute index. If somebody tried to pull up the new page, first it would execute some method, then it would pull up the new page, execute the new action. Right? So these things can be really, really handy. A good way to dry up code. Right? If there's ever a situation where you have the same repeated little bits of code in different parts of your controller actions, you could potentially pull those repeated bits of code out and instead just apply them by using a filter. Right? Like, for example, this line right here in show, where we get a gadget based on an ID number. Right? We have the same line here down in the edit action. Right? We have the same line in the update action. We have the same line in the destroy action. Okay. So for those four, destroy, update, edit, and show, the very first thing we do is we take an ID that we've been given as a parameter and we get a gadget from it. Right. If we wanted to, we could potentially pull that out and put it into another method that's called with a filter. Right. So for example, I could create a new method here. I'll call it getGadget. Right. And I'll put that line in it. So the getGadget method, when it's called, takes whatever ID parameter we've been given and uses it to get a gadget. Okay. Up here then I could say before getGadget. Essentially just telling it before the other actions call the getGadget action. Right? Little bit of a problem with that though, because not every action needs to have that line called first. Right? So in situations where you need to, you can actually sort of rein in what these filters do. By default, if you set up a filter like I'm doing here, it'll be called before every action. But if you want to, you can tie it into specific actions or exclude it from specific actions. So for example, in this case, what I could do is I could say do this only, right, for the show, edit, update, and destroy. Destroy, yeah, actions. You could also, instead of doing only, you could do except. It's except, isn't it? Pretty sure it is. I could say run that method for all the methods except for index, new, and create. Right? So either one of those two ways, they both would essentially amount to the same thing. So in a situation where you want it to run for every action, you don't specify. But the filters also then give you the option of being able to tie them to only running before specific actions or running before all the actions except certain ones that you name. So with that filter in there, let me see if my app still works. Oh, apparently not. Something funny about my syntax it's not liking. Oh, this is what I did wrong. I put this in as a hash. This is supposed to be an array. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay, so the index page works fine. The show page seems to work fine, which is using that before filter. The edit page seems to be okay. Updating works. So yeah, I think that basically takes care of it. Oh, well, the one thing I forgot to do though is that now that we're running that before filter, we can take this line out of show, take this line out of create. Everywhere that we have that line that's being executed by our before filter, we can remove it from the actual actions themselves. Well, it's being called by the filter. So it is still getting called. It's just being called by that getGadget method executing before the actual action. Everything still work now? Yeah, looks like it. Okay. A lot of different ways that the filter could potentially be used. Certainly one that I use it for probably more than anything else is for authentication. Something that we haven't messed with yet, but after we talk a little bit about routes, I definitely wanted to come back and probably use this gadget example, but come back and add some authentication to it so we could have people logging in, logging out, can only access their own gadgets, do that sort of thing. With authentication, the filters work great because you can have certain actions in a controller that you consider to be public, anybody can access them, others that you could consider to be private, those that require authentication. What you could do then is once you've got your authentication basically set up, it becomes very easy to actually apply it to the controller because all you have to do is throw it into a filter. You can just say before all of these actions, which are the ones that I consider private, authenticate, right? So it checks to make sure that the user's logged in. If they're not, then it boots them over to a login page or something like that. So it can be quite handy. There are 3 different filters that can be used in your controller. This one's the before filter. It, of course, executes before the action actually executes, the requested action executes. There's also an after filter. Same basic idea, after filter. The idea with it, of course, is that the requested action executes first and then it executes whatever method you've specified. Let's put in some method there. Right. There's also one called the around filter. Right. What happens with the around filter is that you write whatever method it is that you want to write. We could say do this before the requested action. Right. Then you yield. And then you can say do this after the requested action. Right? So with the around filter, right, it literally can go around the call to whatever action is actually taking place. You can have it do one thing before, or do something before, do something else after. So it kind of takes the place of both before and or after if you happen to need it. Alright, and that's it. They changed the name of these filters in Rails 4. In Rails 4, instead of being called before filter, after filter, I think it's called before action, after action. They just replaced the word filter with action. Reads a little bit clearer, makes a little bit more sense in some contexts. Right? But other than that, nothing about those I think has changed that much in Rails 4.
Is Rails 4 live?
Yeah, but it still sounds like it has some snags. with deployment and things, so I haven't really messed with it too much. Last I read, you still had to jump through some weird hoops in order to get it installed and to get it to work with some gems. So I personally am kind of sitting back from it for a little bit until it gets a little bit more stable. Just don't have a lot of time to spend chipping away at it trying to make it work when I don't especially need it at the moment. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, that's the filters. Right? Kind of a lame example of them, but after we talk about routes a little bit, we'll come back and we'll use filters to apply authentication. So we'll have another example, something else we can do with them here before too much longer. Sound good? Okay. Finally then, let's talk about routes. Routing is really about the only major part of Rails we haven't discussed. At this point, we've talked about the models, we've talked about the views, we've talked about the controllers, so we've been through the entire MVC thing, right? But we haven't talked about routing, and it's kind of weird in a way that I save it to talk about kind of at the end of all that, because routing is very much sort of at the heart of everything that Rails does, how Rails works. It wasn't always that way. Back in Rails 1, routing kind of existed, but just barely. It was kind of a very manual type of affair. You didn't have to really worry about it that much. There was only really one way of ever doing anything. But then when Rails 2 came on, this whole routing engine showed up. It became a much more central and crucial part of working with Rails. I remember I'd kind of learned Rails 1 and built a site or two, and then I kind of sat back for a while and didn't do anything, and the next time I came back to it, Rails 2 was out, and I was utterly and completely lost. It was like I had never known Rails 1 to begin with. It was like starting over again from scratch because of all the new routing stuff. But anyway, routing is very, very crucial nowadays to everything that Rails does. Overall, the basic idea behind routing is that it gives us a way to take a URL and from that URL to determine what controller and action should be executed is really what it comes down to. It also, in some cases, goes back the other direction, where it can take something like a controller and action or a method name and can turn that back into a URL. Right? So it kind of goes both ways to a certain extent. Right? Instead of playing with routes here in this gadgets example, I wanted to start a new example. So let's see here. Let me generate a new example. Rails new. Let's just call it routing example. Okay. All right. Whenever we generate a new app, a new Rails app, in the config directory, we always start off with a file in there called routes.rb. Right? This is basically the way that we sort of interact with and specify everything that we want to actually happen with routes in Rails. Routes overall are the very first part, the very first thing that is encountered if you're coming into a Rails app from outside. Whenever somebody clicks a link or does anything to try to make a request to a Rails app, the very first part of Rails you actually hit is the router. And so the router, of course, then basically takes whatever URL has been requested and attempts to turn that into a controller in action, right, to be executed. And it's basically all the stuff in this file that we put in that determine how that happens, that determine how a URL actually gets translated into a controller and an action inside that controller, right? So very important file. Right? The file is a bit long when you first come to it, or at least kind of seems a bit long, but in actuality there's only really 2 lines in it. Right? If we take all these comments out, that's it. That's all that's actually in this file when we first start. Everything else that was in there was nothing but comments. Okay? What we actually have here is we're essentially calling a method called draw on Rails' routing engine, the routing engine for the application. This draw method then is being passed a block, the do end, and what we can do is inside that block there are a variety of different methods that Rails provides for us that we can call. When we call those methods, essentially what we do is we add routes to the application's understanding of what's going on, might be a way of saying it, right? When we first start off with a new application like this one, it really doesn't know any routes. There are no routes to anything. Right? So we need to tell it what to route to, how to translate the URLs into the actual controller and action pairs. Let's see. Let's start, before we can actually route to anything, by creating something that we can actually route to. Let me jump back over to the console again and let's create a controller. I'm going to do Rails G controller. I'm going to make a new controller called home, the home controller, and I want to give it an index action. So the generator will create the new home controller for me. It'll put an index method into it, right? And it'll go ahead and create the index view for me. That's interesting. Diffed my file. I think it's because I hadn't saved it. What I basically should have gotten would have been that. That's what should have basically appeared in my routes file. How did yours turn out?
It did the exact same thing, except my end was inside the external.
Huh. Very peculiar. Okay, trim it down and keep basically just this, the get home index. That's what it should have basically put there for us. Okay. All right. Now let me jump back over to the console again and let me start up the server.
Didn't it have been from before the migration?
No migration with controllers. So shouldn't have been that. Do you know if you had saved your file or not?
I didn't.
Yeah, I hadn't either. I deleted all those comments, but I never actually hit save. I think that's what caused it, is that it had an unsaved copy, and then it tried to make changes to that unsaved copy. So it was going through and basically trying not to destroy anything. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start up my Rails server. All right, Rails S. There we go. If I go back over to my browser and I go to localhost 3000, I see my typical welcome to Rails page, welcome aboard page. One of the first things that we might want to do with routes is what happens if we don't want this to be the home page for our website. If I go back over to the public folder in my project, the actual file that's being pulled up, that welcome aboard page, is there inside the public folder. It's called index.html. If I don't want that to be my home page and I were to delete that file and move it over to the trash, now in my browser, if I try to go to just localhost 3000, basically giving no path whatsoever, I end up getting a routing error. Well, why is that? Well, the route that it's trying to match is an empty route, basically a route that has nothing in it. And currently in my routes file, it does not say what to do for an empty route. So if we wanted it to, say, automatically go to that index action of our home controller, all we need to do is we need to tell it to map no path over to the home index, right? The home controller's index action. You with me? Right? One of the easiest ways we can create new routes is by using a method that's provided to us called match. Right? Essentially what you do with match is you give it a URL. Here the URL is just going to be empty. And then you specify where you actually want that to go using this type of notation. Home pound index would mean the index method of the home controller. So essentially all we're doing there with this match method is we're telling Rails anytime you have an empty path, an empty URL, right, this is where it's supposed to map to. right? Remember, that's what the routes are all about. Take a URL, turn it into which controller, which action am I supposed to execute. Okay? If I go back over to my browser and I hit refresh, right, it now understands that route, so it automatically, when I now go to no URL, nothing up here, right, just the host name, it takes me to home index. Pretty easy, really. Yeah? Okay. In that particular case, there's actually even a shorter way we can do it. There's a special method we're given called root. Anytime we want to set basically the home page of our site, the root URL, okay, we can do that by saying root to, and then again telling it the controller and action pair. Right? This match that I was using a second ago, or this root method call, will both essentially do that exact same thing. So again, if I just go with no URL whatsoever, just going to localhost 3000, it takes me to home index.
Which one's used more often?
Root. A little bit less typing, it's a little bit more descriptive. When you start putting together a complicated app, it's not uncommon that you might end up with quite a number of those match routes. They don't really stand out. You know, you can get a big glob of them, and it's kind of hard sometimes to spot ones that might be kind of individual, kind of special in a way. Whereas this root method call is used to do exactly one thing. So whenever you see that in a routes file, you know that is the home page.
Is it possible to make a partial call routes around?
A partial? Oh,
Like call the matches in one, call the roots in one?
Not that I'm aware of. It might be possible, but I can't think that I've ever seen anybody do that. Yeah. Okay. So we've got the regular old match method. We've got the root method specifically for when we're wanting to set a home page. Okay. In general, the routes file is always read from top to bottom. So typically, the more generic a route is, the further down you want it. Right. The more specific a route is, the further up in the file you want it. That way you avoid the possibility of having a more generic route be found first and taking the place of a more specific route that may have come later. Right? Because it is possible to have multiple routes that could potentially overlap, could almost be kind of contradictory in a way. So more generic routes towards the bottom, more specific routes to the top. The root one is pretty specific. Right? So I could probably leave it right there and it'll end up being just fine. Okay? Let's play with the match just a little bit more. Let me go over to the home views. App views home. I want to make a new file in there. I'm going to call this new file company underscore information .html.erb. And let's just make this a make-believe page of company information. Man, I'm not typing today. There we go. I'm just going to put a little lorem ipsum on it. Header and a little lorem ipsum. That'll do. Okay. Currently, if I go back to my browser and I say go to home/company information, right? Kind of seems like that ought to get us to that page since company information is part of home. But of course we don't actually get anything. We instead get a routing error, okay? Because we don't have any route that can take /home/company information and turn it into an actual action controller combination to execute. Right? We could, of course, go back to our routes file and we could actually add that if we wanted to. We could say match /home/company information. And I could say route that to home pound company information. And then I go back and I give it a try, and all of a sudden that page becomes accessible, because now it can take the URL that I entered and interpret it, can route it properly over to the right action and controller. We can actually even go a little bit simpler than that if we want to. Just because I named the view file company information doesn't mean that I necessarily even have to use that. I could do something like, say, match/about to home pound company information. Which is a really neat thing. The way that it decouples the actual names of your actions and your files from the actual URLs that somebody types in gives you a lot of flexibility. You can have a little bit of vanity, you might say, in your URLs, where you can actually think about and be concerned with how the URLs themselves actually look, how long they are, how difficult they are to type. Right? So instead of making somebody go to /home/company information in order to see my company information, there's no reason I couldn't let them just type /about, for example. If I go back to my browser and I just go to /about now, it takes me to the exact same page. So that's pretty cool. Right? That's called a regular route. Right? Most of these routes we create with the match method are usually termed just regular routes. Okay? Another one. Let me make another new file over here under Home. Maybe I'll save this file as questions and answers.html.erb. I'd never realized how much typing ERB was like typing web, W-E-B. Just move your left hand over one set of letters and you got it. Let's see, here on this question and answers page, let me put FAQ up at the top. Maybe I'll put in a definition list. Define term. Okay. Who are we? DD. We are who we are. It's kind of a Popeye type answer, isn't it? I is what I is. I am what I am. There. Right. So that could be my little page, questions and answers.html.erb under the home views. I decided to call that file questions and answers because that's basically what it contains. But I don't necessarily, of course, have to use that in the route at all if I don't want to. If I wanted to maybe just let them type /FAQ, FAQ, I could just use the match method and say whenever somebody types /FAQ, that then means that they should be routed to home, oops, no slashes in that one, home pound questions and answers. Bit like that. Back over in my browser, if I go to /FAQ, there we go. I'm at my FAQ page. The name of the file actually being questions and answers, but that becomes almost sort of irrelevant as far as the routes themselves are concerned. That seem okay so far? Nothing too strange there? Okay. Right. Let's jump over to a terminal for a second. I'd previously shown you that you could type rake routes in order to get Rails to come back and tell you about the different routes that it currently sees. And you can see right now from the work we've done, it's automatically set up some different routes for me. Right? There's one in there called home index. That home index is what I'm getting from this that my generator put in for me automatically when I generated my controller. Right? I also have a root route. I got that one automatically because I used the root method to set up basically the home page of my site where I go to if no URL is specified. Okay? With the other three that I've created with match then, you see that essentially what it's done, okay, is it's basically taken something like the original URL and it's converted into a method name. So when I had a match for /home/company information, it turned that into a route that it gave the name home_company_information. Okay. When I had the match for about and for FAQ, it turned those into methods just about and FAQ. Okay. This rake routes command on the command line is indispensable when you're working with your routes file. Because if you're trying to figure out how a route will actually be seen, how it will actually be used in any particular way, it's just a matter of going ahead and typing in the routes line in the routes file that you think you need, and then coming over and running rake routes and seeing if it's being interpreted correctly. See if it turns into the proper URL and the proper controller and action name for you. So pretty neat. Gives you a glimpse inside what the router sees as a result of changes that you've made. Any questions about it so far with those regular routes? Okay. Now, not every route, not every URL like we've been doing here can be quite this simple, right? These are all essentially URLs that never change. The URL for our home page is always just nothing.
For static pages.
Basically, or pages that don't, say pages that don't accept input might be the best way of putting it. I would hesitate to call them static. They could certainly still be retrieving data from the database and displaying them in a dynamic sort of way, but definitely these are pages that are not accepting input in any way. They just do what they do, essentially. Right? Anytime we do have the need for a page that requires some sort of input be given to it, then we have to get into slightly more complicated types of routes, what you might call special routes in a way. Some examples might be some vanity type URLs. Like, for example, what if we wanted a person to be able to come to our blog and we wanted them to be able to type /blog/09/14/2002. And what we would want to happen then is we would actually want Rails to understand those last three parts of that URL as a date and would pull up all of the blog entries that I made for that particular date. Right? We could do that. Or maybe if we had a product website, we could do something like /product/red, where what would happen is whenever a color is put there as the last part of that URL, Rails would automatically understand that it was being given a color and it could go and search for products that were that particular color and dynamically build a page for the user that only showed red products or green products or purple products, whatever they're into, right? So the URLs themselves, right, can very often be used to give information to the routes, to Rails, about exactly what it is that you're wanting to show. We've actually seen this with some of the stuff we've been doing, where we would do things like, say, /gadgets/5, which would show us the gadget that had an ID of 5, instead of just all gadgets or any gadget that was specifically asking for the gadget with the ID of 5. Right? So all of these different routes have sort of dynamic aspects to them, parts where whoever is generating that URL is actually providing input that needs to be taken into account whenever our application actually interprets that route. Right? We can handle those types of URLs, again with the match method. Basically what we would do is we would say what the fundamental part, the unchangeable part of the URL would be. So let's say we're going to have a page in here called show value. And then anytime there's a part to that URL that we want to be dynamic, we basically just put a colon in front of it. So if I said match/showValue/:value, essentially I'm saying there's going to be a URL that's always going to start /showValue, but then the next thing after the slash, after the next slash, this part is going to be dynamic. There could be anything right there for value. Okay? We could then tell it what to actually do with it. I'm going to say, let's go to the home controller and give us the page called show value, which I guess we need to create. So back up under my home views, Let me make a new file. Call it show value, HTML-ERB. Okay. I'll just put a heading up at the top for right now, showing value. And if I go back over to my browser and I go to /show value / and then I type anything there, doesn't literally have to be the word anything. Put a number, put a word, put whatever you'd like, right? It takes me over to the page called show value, right? If instead of typing the word anything, I type in the number 67, it still takes me there, right? If I type in just anything at all, right? The anything at all that I'm typing in up there, right, is considered to be sort of variable. And that's the part that's being handled there by that colon prefaced little variable, you might call it, in the actual route itself, right? There's a second cool thing that's actually happening here, and that's that whenever we have a special route that has a variable portion to it, like what we have here with our show value route, whatever we name that little variable there, that automatically becomes a new key in the params array that we've seen used. And Rails, the router, will then take whatever value is at that part of the URL and will automatically put it into that params array. So in our previous example, we've seen like params :ID a lot. We've seen params :gadget or gadget type. We've seen lots of different things in the params array. How do those things actually get into that params? Well, it's a hash, into that params hash. Well, the way they actually do it is it's all basically working through the router. The router is accepting the request type. If there's value as part of the GET request or part of a POST request, it's seeing those values, those dynamic parts of the request, right? It's pulling those out and it's automatically loading them into that params hash for us. So the same thing should be happening here with our little value from the little match route that we've put together, right? We could give it a try. If I go back to my show value view, right, and I say show params value, okay, then that's going to work alongside this route that I'm putting together so that whatever it is that I put in that value position of the URL should end up there in that hash where it can then be displayed on the page. So if I type in show value /99, I get 99. If I say show value persons _ name, I get persons _ name. Slick little system, don't you think? Not too bad.
Can we go back to our gadgets example and set this up in gadgets? Or?
It was actually done for us automatically in gadgets. Yeah. The way that we handled the routes in gadgets, you might remember I just used a method called resources. Right? That actually did all of this for us automatically. We'll kind of wrap back around and I'll tell you exactly what it was doing here in a few minutes. Well, I think in a few minutes. We're definitely working our way towards that. Okay. All right, with that special route in there, if I jump back over to the console and I run rake routes again, right, you can see that my special route does show up in there. But something about it that's just a wee bit different is you'll notice that it was not given specifically a name. Over here in the very first column of information under what rake routes gives me, where everything else has a name like home index, root, home company information, about or FAQ, my special route with show value in it did not automatically receive a name. Right? Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes we don't really care. The real benefit of those names is that we're able to automatically generate URLs for them more easily, or with them. Okay? Sometimes, though, we don't really care if a route doesn't have a name. It just depends on how convenient or inconvenient it's going to be to work with. If, however, we do specifically want a route to have a name, and it's a type of route like this special route with the value in it that's not automatically given one, then it basically becomes up to us to provide a name. what we could actually do there for our show value route is if we actually wanted to have a name, we can just add another parameter on here called as. I could say set up this route, this URL maps to that controller action as, meaning basically call it, and then I'll say call it show value. If I go back over to the console and run raycut routes again, you can see that route that previously had no name has now been given one, the one that I asked for using that as parameter. So that route is now called the show value route. Any route that actually has something show up there in that first column is referred to as a named route. It's basically a route that we can refer to by name whenever we happen to need to. Right? The names themselves are simply convenient in most cases. Right? If I'm going to jump back over to my index page here. Right? And let's look at those named routes a little bit. Okay? Basically what happens is anytime a route has a name, Rails' router automatically creates two methods to go along with the name that's assigned to it. So my root route that's there, for example, right? Break routes on the terminal tells me that I have a route whose name is root. Did that come out right? A route whose name is root. Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's a strange combination of words. Right? Since I have a route whose name is root, Rails automatically creates two methods for me to go along with that. One is called root path. The other one is called root URL. Here on my index page, let me just print those out. Right? If I just output root path, oops, and root URL, then in my browser, if I go back to the home page, which I can do by not putting in a route at all, I can see what those two actually look like. So the root path is just a slash, whereas the root URL is the full host name, protocol, and the slash, and the port, of course. Okay. Maybe I should label those. Root path, root URL. So there they are. Okay. We have these two basic methods available for any of the different named routes that we have. So how about and fac? Let's say about path. If I do about underscore path, if I put in the about URL, FAQ path, FAQ URL, so there they all are. So essentially the paths are like the local path. You don't need to know the host name, the port, any of that other stuff in order to link locally. The URLs themselves, though, should work anywhere. They're more like an absolute path in internet terms. Okay. You could technically use either one in most situations inside a Rails application. The general convention, though, that most people seem to follow is that in your views, you use the path. In your controllers, you use the URL. I think the reason most people tend to do it that way, the reason I do it anyway, that makes sense to me, is that in my views, a view is pretty much always just linking from itself to some other local resource, some other action controller setup inside the same site. Right? So a path is fine. That's all you need. Inside the controller, though, those controller actions could be potentially called as part of an API from an external resource, in which case it's more important at the controller level that we're giving back these absolute URLs, so that if it is being accessed from some external third-party-ish type source, they're getting URLs back that they would be able to use without having to go through a lot of extra work of figuring out host names and ports and protocols. Yeah. Overall, the reason for those isn't, of course, just so that we can look at them like we're doing here. The reason for them is that it makes everything a little bit easier. Right? If I wanted to, for example, go over to my layout file for this application, and I wanted to put in a little bit of navigation for my site so that I could get to some of the different pages that I've put together quickly and easily, I can, of course, use the link to helper. So if I wanted to, for example, create a route that goes home, I could say link to home. Right? And then if I was going to do it the old-fashioned way, I could say the controller's name is home. Right? The action's name is index. And if I look at that in the browser, that produces a hyperlink for me, and when I click it, it takes me to the home page. Okay? So that works. But isn't it a whole lot more convenient to be able to say link to home and then just say route path? These two URLs, these two hyperlinks that are created here, I should say, create links to the exact same place. One of them is just a fraction of the size and complexity of the other one. So that's where these methods tend to come in handy, the methods that are automatically generated for us to go along with named routes. They make it super easy for us to be able to hyperlink to things, super easy to set up forms that submit to particular things. Right? Instead of always having to be very specific and say the name of the controller, the name of the action like I did there on that first one. Instead, if there's a named route for it, I can just use the method that goes along with that. Right? So I'm just going to comment out that first one. I'll keep the second. There you go. I click that one and it always takes me home. If I wanted to make some other hyperlinks, if I wanted to link to my company information page, the named route that I had that went along with that is about, so I could do about_path. If I wanted to create a hyperlink to go to my questions and answers page, maybe I'll call it Q&A right here. My named route for that was FAQ, so I could do FAQ path. There we go. Almost. See what happened to me up there? My Q&A link. I tried to properly escape my ampersand, right? But Rails kind of kept that from working because it was already kind of trying to treat it as a safe string, or trying to make it a safe string. Okay? So this one I would need to tell it specifically that it's is it safe? Is the word just safe? No?
You can do just the ampersand that works. It's fine.
Yeah, because it's already escaping it. Have you tried validating when you just put the ampersand in?
Yeah, sure.
Validate the page. Okay. I guess Rails is already doing it for me. It's outsmarted me. There we go. Sure enough, yeah. It was doing it for me, wasn't it? Just worry about the kids nowadays, you know? They'll just never know the joy of having to take care of those things by hand. Okay? Anyway.
That's why you start them off at the basic stuff.
Yeah.
Lead them up to what's off.
You bet. Don't show them Rails until they're teenagers.
That's why I showed it to his last day in PHP.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Maybe I'm a little guilty of that too. Okay. There we go. With our routes, so I use the methods for root, for about, for FAQ in order to create hyperlinks to go to those. What about show value? The special route we created called show value. That one was a little bit different from the others because it contained that variable portion, that actual value that was supposed to be passed. In that kind of situation, whenever you want to create a hyperlink to something that contains a variable portion in the URL, the value that you want to fill in for that variable portion just simply becomes an argument that's passed to the methods that Rails generates for that route. So let's see. I'm trying to think of where I'd want to put this link. Maybe just over here on the index page. I'm going to say show value for show value of 99. And then I want to create a hyperlink here. Maybe I should have made that the hyperlink, huh? Or the link text. All right. So using link to create a new link that'll show the user a link that says show value of 99. My named route is show value. Right? I'm going to use the path version of it, so I'm going to make that show value path. Okay. Because that's a special route that has the variable portion to it, value there, what I need to do is I need to pass something to that method. So I'll pass it 99. Maybe I'll create another one just like it that says show value of blah. And in that case, when I call show value path, I'll pass it a string of blah. Okay. So in that case, the URL that's generated for those two will take the argument that I've passed and include that into the generated URL, the generated path, as the variable portion of it. So down at the bottom, if I click on show value of 99, you can see in the address bar, the actual path that's being created has 99 there as the variable portion. If I go back to home, click show value of blah, that one of course is putting blah in as the variable portion. It's really just kind of too easy in a way. Alright, how are we? We haven't made any changes to the route file itself lately, so I think we're all up to date with everything that's there. Do you have any questions about any of the routes we've created? The use of the named route methods? Any of that other fun stuff? Alright. The next step then would be that we have the ability to not only create routes, to give routes names if we choose, but if we want, we can also restrict routes to only responding to particular request types. So the request types that I'm talking about here are the HTTP request types like GET and POST. Right? If we would like, we can set up routes that will only trigger if not only is the URL correct, but also the request type is correct. If, for example, we come over and we look at what Rake Routes gives us right now, home index, the one up at the top, in the second column, you notice it says get right there. That particular route will only respond if the URL is /home/index and if the request type is get. All these other routes that we've put in right, don't have a requirement for the request type, so they will respond to any type of request. As long as the URL is okay, it doesn't care what kind of request it is, it'll just take it. Okay? If we wanted to, though, take a route that we were creating and were to lock it down to a specific type of request, we can do that here in our routes file. We can do that a couple of different ways. One way we can do it is when we're doing a match, like we're doing here for show value. We can add a third or another portion on here called via, another argument. And then with via, what we do is we specify the request type that we want that to work with. So I could say via post. If I go over and I rerun my routes and take a look, show value now shows up being specifically for post requests. So now show value kind of has two requirements that go along with it. One is that the URL, excuse me, yeah, it's itching my throat. The URL has to be /show value/ and then something. But now the request type also has to be post, otherwise that particular route isn't considered a match, or that particular URL is not considered a match. If I go back over to my browser, if I go home and I click one of those show value of links that I created before, like if I click show value of 99, I now get a routing error. The reason I'm getting a routing error is that by clicking on that hyperlink, what I'm doing is I'm sending a GET request. And we just changed the show value route so that it no longer responds to GET, it now only responds to POST. Okay? And this routing error page, thankfully, helpfully, not only shows us the URL that's being requested, but also mentions the request type there, which makes debugging a lot easier. Okay? If I wanted to go back to the index page and I wanted one of these hyperlinks to be able to send a POST request, I could add that in as another parameter, a method parameter. My show value of 99 there, I could say its method is post. I think I'll leave the blah the way it is now. I might just put a comment in there, right? I'll say won't work. Now if I click the show value of 99 link, it's back to working again. The blah link, though, still doesn't work because I didn't tell it to send a post request. Kind of an interesting little trick that Rails is pulling there with that show value of 99 link. The trick is hyperlinks cannot send post requests, period. Hyperlinks can't send anything but GET requests. So what actually happens there, if you go over to the browser and you actually look at that link, inspect the actual code that Rails is creating, you notice that it has in there data-method equals post. Do you see that? Okay. What then happens is Rails has a JavaScript component to it. The JavaScript component goes through the page looking for hyperlinks that have data methods set. And what it then essentially does is it turns that hyperlink into something that simply calls submit for a hidden form that it then automatically builds into the page. Okay. So, I mean, if you think about it, the JavaScript part of Rails comes in, sees that hyperlink with data method post. The JavaScript then dynamically builds in a hidden invisible form on the page, right, that has in it a field that will submit the same value to the same URL that this hyperlink would. right? And then it locks the two together. So when we click that hyperlink, we're not actually clicking a normal hyperlink. What we're doing is we're triggering this hidden invisible form to submit. That's how it's actually sending a post request. It's really kind of amazingly complicated, but it works. And they sure have made it seem awfully simple. Without all of my ham-handed explanation, you'd just think, okay, well, you can make a hyperlink send a post request. No big deal. But it's fascinating because technically that's impossible currently, as far as I know. Yeah. Okay. Under my home views, I'm going to create another new page there. I'm going to call it contact.html.erb. In the page itself, I'm just going to stick a header up at the top, contact page. Okay. Now, if I want to be able to get to that page, I of course have to have a route to get to it, right? Let's say that for whatever reason, I only want that page to be available through post. So what route could I put into my route file in order to make that contact page accessible? You know, I could say match. Let's just make it /contact. And we'll match that up to home contact. Matter of fact, no, let's match it up to home/contact takes us to home contact. So sort of a very traditional looking little route. If I only want it to be available through post, then I can of course say via post. Is that good? Okay. This kind of thing is done very, very often. And as a result, Rails gives us a shortcut. The router gives us a shortcut for writing these types of routes. Okay. Whenever we're creating a route where the URL contains in it the name of the controller and the action in the correct order, like we have home contact here in the URL, home contact here in the actual controller and action pair. When we have that, what we can do is we can essentially omit the second part. I could just do this. If I basically give it a URL, but I don't say which controller and action that URL is supposed to be paired with, then Rails assumes that the first part of the URL is the name of the controller, and the second part of the URL is the name of the action. So here it would assume that we're going to the home controller for the contact action. So this will do the exact same thing that this one did. It's also possible then that I could actually shorten that even more. Instead of saying match /home contact via post, what I could do is I could just say post to /home/contact. I don't even think we need that beginning slash. I could just say home/contact. Okay. So all three of these are actually going to produce essentially the same route. Doesn't work in every situation. Like up here when we were doing about and contact, where there was a mismatch between the URL we were typing and the actual action that we wanted to have executed in our controller. In that case, we have to go with this full-blown match method. But for home company information up here, we could have actually taken that one and written it without that second part in there at all. And instead of using match, since it's a GET request we're using to get it, we could just say GET home company information. And that would have given us essentially the same thing. This very first line up here at the top of my routes file, the one that was put in for us automatically when we ran the generator to create the home controller, does that then explain what that thing is, how that works? Essentially, what it put in there for me automatically was the same as if I had said match home/index to home pound index via get. Take a look at my routes. Everything's still basically there and working the same way it was before. Nothing in particular has changed, except that I've added that home contact route that wasn't there previously. But there you go. Do you have any questions? You can do an awful lot with just this. There are some other weird little dark and dusty corners of routing that you can get into. Some strange kind of things you can do with it on occasion. Right? But this probably covers 95% of everything you ever need to do with routes. The match method, right? The root method, plus a few gets and posts and deletes and those sorts of things here and there. The workhorses get most everything done you need to get done. Okay. All right. Let's talk about RESTful routes then. I've mentioned it to you a couple times, right? RESTful routes is something that Rails always wants to do kind of by default. It's the basic idea of how all default routes in Rails are set up. They're all set up to be RESTful routes, right? REST, R-E-S-T, stands for Representational State Transfer, which is super important. I bet your day will be brighter and sunnier now that you know that, right? Not especially, right? Really what the idea behind REST is to provide a way for different applications to communicate with one another. I think it was last week when we were talking about the respond to blocks in the controllers, that when we were talking about how a controller action not only can return HTML but could return JSON or XML, that sort of stuff, we were talking about Rails apps being used as APIs. Basically, some other application could make a request of your application, could specify how they want the data returned, could say I want that data as XML or I want that data as JSON, and your application then, because of the respond to block, could potentially return the information in the format that it was requested. Right? Taking a step back from that idea, though, how would another application know how to ask your application for data in the first place? Right? So if we're thinking about a situation where there's multiple applications, web applications, local applications, whatever, it doesn't matter what kind of program we're talking about. Right? Say we've got two web applications, application A and B. And let's say that application A has data about zip codes broken up by state. Right? In application A, you can look up a state and it'll tell you all the zip codes for that state. Application B then, maybe is an e-commerce application. They have a checkout form where a person has to put in their billing address. And part of putting in the billing address means that they have to type in their state and select their zip code. And they think, well, you know, to make life a little bit easier, instead of making them type in the zip code, maybe I should just give them a list of what zip codes there are in that city or in that state. So they look around and they find application A, who already has that information available. Right? So application B basically wants to be able to send a request whenever somebody's checking out over to application A say, here's the state the person typed in, what zip code should I show them? Does that make sense? All right. So how does application B know how to ask application A? In what format does application B make that request? Right? What's the protocol? Right? What format does the request need to be sent in? What information needs to be provided? All of that sort of stuff. Right? That's kind of what we're talking about here with REST, is how does the actual communication, generally the request being made of an application, how does it actually get formed so that the application that's being requested of, application A in this example, so that it will understand what the other application is asking for. Okay? Through time, there have been a lot of different ways that this would happen. In the old days, they used to use what was called SOAP, or XML RPC. SOAP was the Simple Object Access Protocol. XML RPC was XML Remote Procedure Call. Again, more stuff to brighten up your gray, rainy day. Right? Yay, SOAP. Both of those were XML based, and essentially what had to happen was whenever an application wanted to make a request of another application, if they were using SOAP or XML RPC, the requesting application had to put together this big, gnarly, most of the time, XML document that contained information about what request was being made, what format that request was being made in, when it was being made, what was to be done with the response when it was sent back. Right? It was very complicated. I did a couple applications that used SOAP, and oh, it was a nightmare. To this day, I still hate SOAP. SOAP like communication protocol SOAP. Regular SOAP like you wash yourself with, I'm okay with that. Right? But anyway, they're just very, very, very complicated. Right? But they were important because it was important that when applications need to be able to communicate with each other, there needs to be some kind of standard. If every single application just did things completely their own way, then it would be very difficult. Every time you wanted to communicate with a new application, it would be like reinventing the wheel. You'd have to come up with a whole new everything in order to be able to carry out the communication. So while SOAP and XML RPC were really complicated and not fun to work with, at least they were standardized. So once you did figure out SOAP, once you did write a library that allowed your application to communicate using SOAP, you could then communicate with any other application that knew how to respond to SOAP requests. Right? Well, what REST basically is a third option. Instead of SOAP, instead of XML RPC, these big complicated XML request types, somebody said, well, you know, why don't we just use HTTP? All SOAP and XML RPC really are protocols for sending requests and getting responses. Well, on the web, we've been using HTTP, which is just a protocol for sending requests and getting responses. Why don't we just use that? Right? And that's basically kind of where the idea for REST came from, was instead of these big, gnarly, complicated XML communication protocols, let's just use URLs. Right? A URL, if written in a standardized way, could be used to do basically all of the communication that web applications might need to be able to do with each other. Any kind of application, technically, might need to be able to do with each other. Right? So there's this idea of REST. Right? And Rails embraces that idea in what they call RESTful routes, basically routes that are put together here in our routes file that comply with this REST standard. So any software in the world that has the ability to communicate using this REST protocol will be able to communicate with a Rails app, and Rails apps can very easily communicate with any other application that understands and can work with REST. Does that sound okay? That's kind of the background behind this RESTful route stuff, right? I think we'll probably go ahead and shut down here for today, but what we'll do on Wednesday is talk more about exactly what these RESTful URLs look like, what these RESTful routes actually look like. Learn how to read them, learn how to interpret them, all of that good sort of stuff. That's where we'll start next time. Good? All right. Excellent. I'll see you day after tomorrow.